This week on Q&A, our guest is Leo Damrosch, a Harvard professor who's written a new book about Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville and his 1831 journey around America to study the young country and its inhabitants. Tocqueville wrote about his observations in the book Democracy in America.
Leo Damrosch, what's the most interesting personal thing you learned about Alexis de Tocqueville?
Well, I think that he's not the kind of Olympian abstract theorist that we assume he is, because we've all read part at least, or even all of Democracy in America. He was a volatile, emotional, very complicated, kind of depressive young man, and very adventurous. So when he was in America, he was 25 and he was having an adventure.
When did he live and when did he come to the United States?
He was born in 1805. His parents had very nearly been executed in the French Revolution because they were aristocrats. He grew up in a very privileged family that wanted the old monarchy back. He knew it wasn't coming back. He knew democracy was the future and he thought it should be. And he came to America in 1831 when he was just 25. Partly in order to study our prison system, which he'd been mandated to do by his government, but really to understand why this great democracy succeeded when France was having one revolution after another.
He came with a companion, as you point out, Mr. Beaumont. Who was he and why did he join him on the trip?
They were best friends. They were apprentice magistrates at Versailles. They expected a lifelong career in government, which they did have. And it was a kind of essential partnership. Beaumont was the gregarious one. He was a lot of fun. Somebody once said they complement each other like the oil and vinegar in a salad. And Beaumont would break the ice, be a kind of social inspiration for Tocqueville. But he also looked up to his friend. He knew Tocqueville was a kind of genius, and he admired him.
As you probably know, back in 97 and 98, we did a lot of Tocqueville. And I'm sure some of the audience go, oh no, there they go again. But I want to show you one of the reasons why we did and ask you why there has not been as much of this in the last 10 years. Let's watch this, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Alexis de Tocqueville.
Tocqueville noted it years ago.
Do you know his story?
Tocqueville, Democracy in America.
Tocqueville himself said.
Do you know his journey?
De Tocqueville's Tocqueville.
Alexis de Tocqueville, the brilliant French author.
Alexis de Tocqueville. 166 years ago, France was his home. But America was just ahead, and it was here he found the words to write Democracy in America, a book still part of today's political conversations.
You know, the reason we did such, went to 55 different cities and we went over to a chateau over in France and all that, was because those politicians and those writers were talking about him all the time. I really haven't heard that much in the last 10 years. Am I right, or have I just missed it?
Oh, he still gets quoted. Problem is, he can be quoted on every side of the spectrum, and that's because he was so broad-minded himself. There's often more than one side to a question, and you can quote him accurately, seeming to contradict himself. So it's quite true that President Reagan's speechwriters, or my former colleague Cornel West on the more left-wing side, can quote Tocqueville. But maybe people have kind of overdosed on him, which is too bad. I don't think the great book is read as much as it deserves.
This book, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux published your book. What made them think that you could sell this book?
Well, they have a wonderful editor there. His name is Eric Chinsky. He loves ideas and the history of ideas, and he loves American history. And I think he thought this is a way to open up Tocqueville's ideas. I think, you know, his great book is 800 pages long. I think many of us have forgotten to finish it. And this is a way of showing the human side of where it came from.
Where do you reside now?
Boston, Massachusetts. I teach at Harvard.
How long have you been at Harvard?
20 years.
And what did you do? Well, start in the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Manila 3 months before the war began and spent my toddler years in a Japanese internment camp. My father was a missionary. We went back after the war. In fact, I just recently read Alan Brinkley's excellent biography of Henry Luce. He was a missionary son. I think we had some things in common. Loved the Philippines, came back in 1950 when I was about 9. My family lived mostly in Maine after that. I was sent to a prep school in Connecticut. I'm kind of a rootless person. After my education was over, I taught at University of Virginia for 15 years, and then right here at College Park for 6 years, and then went to Harvard.
At the University of Maryland?
Yep.
And the 3 schools you went to get your degrees?
Undergraduate at Yale, and 2 graduate years at Cambridge University in England, and then finished at Princeton.
How many years were you in that internment camp?
Better part of 3.
You didn't remember any of it, though.
Well, I was 3 when there was a brilliant airborne rescue. They dropped paratroops into our camp, which was in a very parlous situation. The Americans had landed, the guards were panicking, we might not have lived. And they actually got us all out alive, many of them infirm elderly people and children like me. That's my first memory, is being rescued from that camp.
Can you remember the first moment this was an idea for a book?
Yeah, I do. I had finished a biography of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which took me quite a few years. I had heard somehow, which is true, that Rousseau was one of Tocqueville's 3 favorite writers. I was looking for something to read just to keep up my French. I thought I'll take a look at Democracy in America, which actually in the original is wonderfully eloquent. Most translations are kind of clumsy and stodgy. Though not, I'll recommend for your viewers the recent one by Arthur Goldhammer, which is in the Library of America series. That's a beautiful translation of Tocqueville. And I started reading it, and I just got curious about where this book came from. What did he know about America? And discovered it's been 70 years since anyone really thought about that journey that he took. And the light bulb went off, and I thought this might be a really interesting subject.
Now, we did spend a lot of time with George Pearson.
Yes.
Who wrote the book 70 years ago that you're talking about. How did you approach it so that you were different?
Well, Pearson's book is a classic. It's the resource we all rely on. He was a professor at Yale. A huge trove of Tocqueville papers fetched up at Yale, and Pearson became their custodian. But it's very dated. Written in the 1930s. There have been so many wonderful historians and political scientists who've written on Tocqueville since then that there's an enormous kind of range of contexts that a writer today could bring that Pearson didn't. And also what he's really trying to do was just identify who everyone was, which he brilliantly did. A couple of 100 people that get mentioned in Tocqueville's notebooks and letters. He traced them and found out who they were. But it's not a very readable book, and it, I don't think, brings Jacksonian America to life. It's really just following the journey.
And why is that a problem?
Well, because I speak for myself, certainly. I'm kind of a history buff, though I'm a professional historian. I feel like we've overdosed on the founders, wonderful as they were. Those were, 18th century British colonial gentlemen. They lived in a world utterly unlike ours, although they helped to create ours. And by the 1830s, Jackson was our first populist president. We'd become a great commercial nation. We were expanding at an incredible rate into the hinterland. It was the beginning of the America we all know. And I called my book Tocqueville's Discovery of America. It was really my voyage of discovery, too.
How'd you go about it?
Well, I went about it, first of all, by, of course, reading a lot of historians, both biographers of Jackson and historians of the period in general, and also quite a bit of political science writing about Tocqueville. The best of all books, I'll just mention this one, is Sheldon Wolin's book called Tocqueville Between Two Worlds. And his theme is that he's neither a reactionary aristocrat like his family, nor is he an ideological Democrat. He certainly was appalled by socialism, which was already beginning to exist. So he's caught in between, and it gives him a kind of breadth and depth of perspective. Did a lot of reading of that kind to get up to speed on my subject. And then I got into books written by other visitors to America at the time, and there's a quite surprising number of them. Could mention a couple. Frances Trollope, the mother of the great novelist Anthony, spent 2 weird years in Cincinnati trying to recover from a bankruptcy by running a huge sort of department store that failed horribly. Went back to England, wrote a book saying how awful the Americans were. And it's full of prejudice and snobbery, and although she's a very intelligent woman, she barely gets a sense of what America really was. Even the great Dickens, who was here 10 years later, was quite snobbish. One thing that anecdotally that struck me was Tocqueville's English was serviceable when he got here and excellent by the time he left 9 months later, but it was never that of a native speaker. And these British people would come over and be offended by Americanisms. Francis Trollope says, they'll say, "Go the whole hog," or they'll say, "Keep cool, mother, I know a thing or two." And they even called her children honey, which she thought was outrageous. That didn't bother Tocqueville because he wasn't picking up those little nuances. If he met a really intelligent backwoods pioneer, he wrote down what the guy said to him.
Did Americans buy Fanny Trollope's book or Charles Dickens' book on America?
Well, they bought them in order to be appalled, and they felt insulted and betrayed by these visitors that they had entertained hospitably. Trollope had a axe to grind. She was very conservative in British terms. They were on the eve of the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which finally opened up the voting privileges in England, and she was hoping to show democracy was so evil that it ought to be prevented.
Another one you wrote, another person you wrote, quoted some, was Harriet Martineau?
Yeah, Harriet Martineau was more liberal, more progressive, a very intelligent woman, wrote a 3-volume book on American culture, which is a kind of compliment to Tocqueville's. It's not as searching, but it's full of interesting reflections. And she liked American speech. At one point she was in a stagecoach and one of the other passengers mentioned someone to his friend and said, "He's a smart fellow, isn't he?" And the friend said, he couldn't see through a ladder.
Talk about the research business, because I know you say in here that you translated from French to English and some of the letters and the marginalia and things like that. How did you set out to do that? Where did you find it?
Well, a lot of it is in print, but much of it not in English. And everything that isn't printed, it tends to be at Yale, because fortunately that great collection includes copies of now lost material that the Tocqueville family once had. So everyone who writes about Tocqueville spends some time at Yale looking at those things. But partly it's just, I think people who write about him from an academic point of view aren't so interested in the anecdotal material. So, for example, there are a lot of scraps that didn't ever get into Democracy in America because maybe they seem just too storytelling, that are actually very rich. And they're still among Tocqueville's papers as rejected materials.
I want to tell you about the experience we had, and maybe you can shine some light on it. Not an academic. And when we set out to do our Tocqueville thing in the late 1990, as I said, 1997 or so, we went to the Beinecke Library at Yale.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I don't know who the fellow was, and the names aren't important, but he refused to let us see the material. We're not academics, and I suspected you had a different experience there. And I wondered, I don't think he's still there, but it was really, we were just astounded. I said, we're going to do this whole series on it, and we'd like to show our audience your stuff. And they said, no, we're not. He came out and said, I'm not interested. I never met the man. He never came out. What is that all about?
It's quite extraordinary.
Is it different now?
It must be different now. I mean, because, in fact, there are a lot of independent scholars who have no academic position who write wonderful books, and certainly I know our rare book library would welcome anybody who came and knew what they wanted to look at. I can't imagine why that happened.
Did you get to put your hands on the original material where they let you see that?
Oh, yeah. They bring me these boxes full of loose pieces of paper, notes and letters and so on. Yeah, it's a wonderful collection, and they're very generous, allowing you to, it's a carefully controlled room where they make sure you don't leave with any of their possessions. But no.
I'm going to take it a step farther, because this has always been something that I've been baffled by. We went to the chateau in France, and they have this. Have you been there?
No, I have not.
They have this garret where they keep a lot of the papers of Tocqueville, and we wanted to see some of this. And the Count, who was very generous to us and all that, really didn't want us to see anything but one letter. And I wanted to see one of the cahiers, the notebooks. And I'm going to show you some video in a moment, because they wouldn't let me see a cahier until we did a program, and it wasn't done formally. But what were the cahiers? Why were they important, and did you see them?
I didn't try to. I looked at one because I wanted to see there was supposed to be a sketch of a log cabin in it, and it was so vestigial that I didn't end up using it in the book. But they've all been, copied and reprinted. But what they were was little pocket notebooks that he kept so that right after a conversation, usually the same evening, he could jot down a pretty accurate account of what he had heard. And he just took sheets of paper, folded them in half to make them smaller, sewed a binding down the middle, and shoved them in his pocket. And so they do feel like touching the journey itself.
Are they available, all the words that are on those,
all
available to any researcher?
Printed, yeah. And the thing is, I mean, it may sound like not using primary sources when you ought to, but in fact, if something's been printed by a good scholar, then they'll have notes explaining things that are confusing or, correct something that they knew in some other place got corrected. And so they're actually more helpful than the original.
What did you learn from the notebooks?
Everyone from Pearson on, he was the first one who began publishing them, has certainly used them, so I didn't learn anything nobody had seen before. But I certainly learned that Tocqueville had a really omnivorous interest in things. He was, of course, trained as a lawyer, and he often talked to lawyers, and he often wrote down details about the law. But for example, when they visited the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which was then quite new, shall I just briefly describe why they were interested in penitentiaries? Sure. Jails in Europe at that time were just holding tanks, get people off the street, and they would throw in their pickpockets and mass murderers, and everybody would all be in one big room giving each other grief and bribing the jailers and teaching each other criminal techniques. And it was a very reformist idea, the name penitentiary suggests. Maybe the prisoner could repent, maybe be rehabilitated and come out a better human being. And this experiment was being tried in America. Sing Sing in New York was another that Tocqueville also visited. But at Eastern State, the system was this. Oddly enough, it was a Quaker idea. It was a high-minded ethical idea that the prisoner should be under absolute isolation 24 hours a day, never see another face, food put in through a revolving door, and his only book would be the Bible, which, as a later visitor said, however good, must sometimes pall. And he would then repent. In fact, they went crazy. They couldn't stand it. So the reform was included that they should have some work to do. They would be given leather and learn to make shoes or whatever. Tocqueville was allowed to interview these guys who almost never saw a human being. He didn't expect to do it for more than a day or two. He was there a week and a half writing it all down because it was so moving, the kind of almost tragic despair. Somebody would be in jail for stealing a horse. He would get 10 years in prison. He would expect to never see his family again. Never seeing another person. So what was meant to be a high-minded reform was in fact an appalling kind of torture. That's an example of what the notebooks would contain.
Besides the little notebooks, did he take more notes than that?
Yeah, what he did was he wrote, and so did Beaumont, very long, detailed letters home with the understanding their families would keep them, and it would be a kind of ongoing journal of the voyage. Beaumont also kept an elaborate diary privately, and unfortunately that got lost, so we don't have that. So the resources are not just the published Democracy in America, but all the loose papers that might have got in it and didn't, plus these notebooks, plus the letters home. It's quite a rich array of resources.
All right, I want to share with you this moment for me, because as I learned how to get interested in all this from people like you who do all this research, and so we were on the trail to see the notebooks. We're told can't see them, and I did get a chance though to. You'll see. Let's wait. Before we do that, this is the woman you're going to see on the set with us. They're in Tocqueville's home is Françoise Melonio.
Oh, she's a distinguished Tocqueville scholar.
Yeah, and who is very much a fan of the families, and they've shared everything with her, and you'll see why this moment mattered to me.
Okay.
What do you have there?
And that's a cahier, a book note. And that's notes he took during the travel, especially when he was riding.
This is what he used to keep a diary during his trip.
Yeah.
Called a cahier.
Cahier portable.
How many of these did he have?
We have 4 of these.
At the time he was in the United States, so how many did he have altogether?
But that's was one sort of cahier, but there are other ones, just like this one, you see, because he has alphabetical cahier too.
Okay, now what is this?
That's about the Indians too, and that's an alphabetical cahier. So you have on Americans and then Indians, and
it's by the letters.
By the letters of the.
And this is the way he kept his notes.
Yes.
You can see it was very exciting for me, but and why? Because you know that seemed to be a very important part of Tocqueville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely was.
But you did not go to Paris?
No, I didn't. This is really a book about America, and it's not an original piece of Tocqueville research. I draw upon people who've done that. So it's more trying to animate what our culture was like at that moment and how this extraordinarily intelligent foreigner saw things that Americans themselves didn't see so clearly. But also my theme was how most of the main ideas in democracy in America were originally suggested by Americans. It's because he was a great listener. And some of them were very distinguished people like John Quincy Adams, some of them utterly unknown. And those notebooks are full of the seeds of ideas that then blossom into chapters in his great book.
You talk about this in your book, his attitude toward Andrew Jackson, and when did he meet with him?
Unfortunately, at the very end, when he'd been totally biased against him. He started in New York and in Boston, where the East Coast establishment were, the enemy Jackson was trying to supplant. He was our first populist president. Probably most people remember that in 1824 he had the most popular votes, but because there were 4 candidates, not a majority, and what looked like a backroom deal by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams threw the election to Adams in the House of Representatives. So for 4 years, Jackson should have been president and wasn't. In 1828, he had been elected, and most of these, patricians that Tocqueville met at the beginning of his trip feared Jackson, thought he was a backwoods bully, and won an irrelevant battle in New Orleans long ago. It's the only thing that got him a reputation. It's terribly short-sighted. Jackson had an unbelievable charisma. He was a very intelligent, thoughtful person and great leadership qualities, and Tocqueville just didn't get it.
How long did he meet with him?
Oh, half an hour at most. In those days, it wasn't hard to arrange a meeting in the White House. So he and Beaumont shook hands with the president, who was exhausted, ill, had no idea his reputation and a great book was at stake. He was polite to a couple of young Frenchmen.
And how did he meet John Quincy Adams, and what was he doing when he met him?
He met him in Boston at the house of Edward Everett, who was a politician who's notorious now for droning on for 2 hours at Gettysburg before Lincoln gave his immortal address. He was very impressed with Adams. Adams had, in Tocqueville's view, willingly lost the presidency in 1828 rather than compromise his principles, and had just been elected to the House of Representatives, which then, as it would now, seemed like an extraordinary choice for a politician to make, having been president. So, in addition, Adams, thought deeply about American history, was the son of one of the founders, spoke perfect French, had had a great diplomatic career. So Tocqueville was deeply impressed by his wisdom.
Tocqueville lived for how many years?
Lived
Till
he was 53. He had tuberculosis, incurable at that time. From not much later than his American trip onward, he would have repeated breakdowns and recoveries, and eventually it got him.
How long was he married, and when did he marry, and who did he marry?
Oh, that's interesting too. He fell in love with and was determined to marry a middle-class English woman. Her name was Mary Motley, or Marie he called her. But he knew his family would never accept marriage outside their social class, so he kept his engagement totally secret from them for some years. He was already secretly engaged when he was in this country, though intensely flirtatious. I might digress on that because it's quite interesting. He and Beaumont noticed that young American women, unmarried women, were perfectly free to hang out with unchaperoned with young men, and speak very freely with them, whereas in France they would have been rigidly controlled. But they never went further than that. And in France, once they were married, then it was assumed they would take a lover on the side. And the American married woman went on being virtuous and chaste, or so he believed. And given his tendency to find reasons for things, he thought there was a reason. He thought in France, marriages, at least in his class, were dynastic transactions. Two families made a negotiation. If the young couple didn't dislike each other, that was the most they could hope. So of course they would take a lover. He said, in America, the family is the center of effective life. It is the heart of what would otherwise be a totally competitive individualism. Therefore, people marry people, they choose who they marry, and they want them, and they want to be faithful to them. It was an interesting way of putting it.
And if he came here today, did the same trip again, and you have to explain what kind of people he had interaction with, what would he see today? What would he conclude about the whole marriage, the relationship of men to women?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, there were feminists in his time, and he had the deepest respect for his wife's intelligence, and I think he wouldn't be surprised that things have liberalized in that way. But I don't think he was a prophet of kind of social behavior so much as of political and government change. I'm not sure what he would say about that. One of the first bloggers who noticed my book headlined his little comment, Tocqueville was really into hot American chicks.
I want to pick up on some of the copy in your book, some of the quotes,
Sure.
and relate it to what we know today. This is from Beaumont, Gustave de Beaumont.
Yes.
And you mentioned that both Beaumont and Tocqueville were aristocrats.
Mm-hmm.
Define that.
They came from families with inherited titles. There is a chateau, as you mentioned, at a village called Tocqueville. And in fact, apparently it's incorrect to call him de Tocqueville because if you inherit a title from a place name in France, then that is simply your name. We don't say de Lafayette. Whereas Charles de Gaulle was a middle-class person putting on airs by putting a de in front of his name. Beaumont also came from a town called Beaumont. And the important thing then was you were born into a social rank which was permanently yours. And the first thing Tocqueville said when he got to New York was, this is an unbelievably egalitarian society. And of course he could see some people were very rich and many were very poor. But in principle, anyone could change their position in the social scale. And they knew it and believed it. And if they couldn't make it in the East, they might go West. They might hack out a piece of the wilderness and get rich, in the boonies. And there's some truth to that. So there was no equivalent, not even those Boston Brahmins, to the class he was born in, which was just a permanent authentication of status.
We have video from our series that we did on the chateau. We can put on the screen so you can see what it looks like. And the interesting thing about this is it's in Normandy, not far away from Omaha Beach and the other beaches. We didn't go to the Beaumont village. You can see it there, but that's right now. I mean, the ancestry there, and we haven't been in touch with him for the last 13 years. Count Duraville lived there, and it was his place. Came down, I believe, if I remember correctly, through his wife, who was a descendant of one of the brothers of Tocqueville, and they still had it in the family.
Tocqueville had no children himself, so yeah, it went to his brothers.
Why is that? I mean, do you remember, was that a decision they made not to have children?
No, they wanted to and didn't, and Tocqueville would have loved to because he's very dynastic. He wanted his name to be inherited, so who knows why, health problems perhaps.
But back to the comments of Beaumont, the end quotes in your book. The Americans are a nation of merchants, devoured by a hunger for wealth that brings many far from honorable passions along with it, such as greed, fraud, and bad faith. They seem to have but one single thought here and one single goal, which is to make their fortune. Has that changed?
Well, even Beaumont, and certainly Tocqueville, would have put it differently by the end of the trip. That was when they'd first got to New York, and they were kind of staggered by the commercial frenzy And in the class they grew up in, you were supposed to be above mere money. So there was a kind of snobbish prejudice against making money. But quite rapidly they both saw, and Tocqueville always, I think, more generously and deeply than his friend, that in a society which doesn't have inherited status, how much you make is a way of proving that you have made it. And so inevitably, people are measured by their wealth, he thought, and it's what they strive for. But he also, by the time he wrote his great book, which was some years later, reflecting on what he'd seen, he said there's a peculiar anomie, a kind of melancholy in the American character, because since you could always have more, you've never got enough, you've never reached the goal, it always recedes from you. I think that would be the kind of insight he would bring today. That,
what would it have been like in France then?
Oh, in France then, the commercial class were like your servants, in the way he was brought up. You wouldn't dirty your hands with money. When he published his masterpiece, he didn't know how to get a contract from a publisher or whether to ask for royalties or, all those things were news to him. I think he ended up impressed in America, not so much by money making simply in itself, but by the energy with which people would create a career for themselves. Can I give you one quick anecdote? Cincinnati in those days was still the edge of the frontier. The city was still being created. There was mud everywhere where streets hadn't been laid out. And he said, this is democracy without limit. Because after all, if you grew up in John Quincy Adams' family, they were a 200-year-old patrician establishment in Boston. In Cincinnati, everyone had just arrived. In 1800, there were 50,000 people in what was about to be the state of Ohio. By 1830, there were 1 million, most of them young. And there's one example that kind of tickled me. He met a 23-year-old lawyer who had just arrived from New Hampshire and was considering a career in public service. But he said, it's terrible out here. They're so crude. You have to get drunk with the voters in order to be elected. I don't know if I can do that. He said, but maybe at the national level it'll be better. Well, it was Salmon P. Chase. He became senator and governor of Ohio, Lincoln, secretary of the Treasury, the team of rivals, and ended up Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that was exactly what Tocqueville was seeing. This 23-year-old nobody has left New England in order to create a life for himself. So it's not just making money, it's making a world for oneself.
What did you think of the book itself, Democracy in America? And I've got two versions of it here. This one's a abridged version, years old. I think I paid $4 in a bookstore for it. It's a tiny little thing. It's the double volume, The World's Classics, Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. And this is, I believe, the Reeve edition?
Yeah, that's the original English translation. Tocqueville actually got to know Henry Reeve and corresponded with him.
What's that? How does that read compared to the one that you're recommending that people read now?
Reeve is kind of careless. I don't think his French was so great. Tocqueville's English wasn't so perfect that even if he'd seen it before it came out, and I don't think he saw the whole text, he would have necessarily caught everything. But the main problem is this: Tocqueville's style is kind of abstract and very formal. The French critic Sainte-Beuve said, it's the classic French style of the 17th century. When he describes Choctaw Indians on their way to the Trail of Tears, you don't, hear the shouts and you don't see the painted feathers. He said, but the tragic sorrow is profound. And for that you need rhythm. You need the kind of music of the prose. And most translations just don't have that.
Now here's one. I didn't see you mention this in your book. This is maybe you did. Harvey Mansfield's?
Yeah,
who's a fellow Harvard professor.
Yeah, Harvey's a great political scientist, and he and his wife did that translation. It's a workmanlike, good translation, but I don't think it catches the flavor of the original. And the one I recommend by Arthur Goldhammer, who's a very gifted translator of French books, I think does get something more like the flow and power of the language.
Did you read Democracy in America in French?
Yeah.
And explain, if you can, when you translate, what the difference is. I mean, how would you, what different feeling do you have when you read it in French versus when you read it in any English?
Well, I think a French sentence can go on for quite a long time without losing its way because the clauses depend on each other in sort of very predictable ways. So you kind of always know that you're moving forward steadily, and you can kind of listen to the music or the rhythms of the language. But to put it into English, usually you have to break it down, find pauses, start the thought over again, so it doesn't just kind of wear you out by trudging along, which is what a too literal translation will do.
I saw, and I want to go back to your earlier writings to put them, if there's a way to put them in context with writing about Tocqueville, who that was in the 1800s, and you spent a lot of time writing about, I assume, thinking about the 1700s.
Yes.
Samuel Johnson. Who was he?
Samuel Johnson was a great English writer at the middle and late part of the 18th century. Very miscellaneous writer. He edited the first great dictionary of our language. He was the first great editor of Shakespeare. He wrote essays which are very deep and thoughtful, but not much read anymore. He wrote a set of biographies called Lives of the Poets, which are very rich. He's really a teacher of wisdom, a sort of thoughtful reflector on human life. I got interested in him when I was quite young, and I began writing about Johnson.
Why did you get interested?
He seems a very moving figure. There's a book by my late former colleague Walter Jackson Bate from the 50s called The Achievement of Samuel Johnson. He was seriously neurotic, deeply melancholy is the term they would have used then. Also had OCD, which hadn't even been diagnosed till the 1980s, so compulsive behavior he hated and didn't understand. And out of this complicated, troubled personality, he created this sort of deep, wise perspective on human life that is indeed a great achievement.
Lived for how long? What years?
He was born in 1709 and died in 1784, so he kind of spanned the 18th century.
Anybody that goes through school always hears about Boswell's Johnson.
Yeah.
Who was Boswell?
James Boswell was young enough to have been his son. He was a Scottish aristocrat who came down to London to have a good time when he was in his early 20s and wrote a very lively, still very enjoyable diary, which is known as Boswell's London Journal. But he was also a collector of great men, and because he had a very judgmental father, in fact his father was a Scottish judge, he was, we would now say, looking for a father figure. And he fastened on to Johnson and made Johnson his hero and wrote down extended conversations that he'd been present at that Johnson would preside over. And so his big Life of Johnson is a kind of amazing recreation of the very voice and spirit of this hero of his.
What do you figure got you interested in this stuff in the beginning?
In which stuff in particular?
All this. I mean, following these, Rousseau or Johnson or Tocqueville. I mean, where did this come from?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm one of those people who's always been a good student and never stopped being a student. I've often wondered, whether that was a little cowardly of me, but I just kept getting degree after degree and found myself teaching, and I love to teach. I think I'm interested in ideas, but not as abstractions, the way a lot of academics are. I'm always interested in where they come from, which is why I've ended up doing something more like biography. So, for example, when I wrote a biography of Rousseau, I'm very interested in how somebody who wrote brilliantly about how every known human culture has inequality built into it, how that person had in fact worked as the lowest kind of household servant, experienced every kind of discrimination because of who he seemed to be, and when he found himself an intellectual writing books, was really pouring his soul into the message that he had. And likewise with Tocqueville, I was trying to show that the great truths of democracy in America are not the product of abstract reflection, that it's because he's listening to Sam Houston and John Quincy Adams and backwoods storekeepers that he's coming to these insights.
Connie Debley, who produces this program, told me in passing that this might be your first television interview.
Yes, it is.
First television interview. Never been interviewed on television before?
Well, if you write academic books, they have a readership of 800 other academics, many of them your rivals. It's a very specialized game indeed. The Rousseau book did quite well, but Americans aren't so interested in Rousseau, so there wasn't any likelihood of publicity.
Well, let me ask you before we pass Rousseau, what's the biggest reason that we should read him now?
Which one, Rousseau?
Rousseau.
Oh, we should read Rousseau, partly because of his insights, I think, into society. I'll mention two books. The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, which I've already just been alluding to, is an incredible kind of imaginative feat to say not how does inequality work and did God intend it that way or whatever, but what is it about human culture that always stratifies into some on top and some below? And it's the profound question we've never stopped asking. And then the social contract, which had a lot to do with the U.S. Constitution and is why I think he was one of Tocqueville's favorite writers. I'll just give you one example from that. When Tocqueville was in Boston, one of his informants was a young German immigrant named Francis Lieber. Franz Lieber, he was born. Lieber had fought at the Battle of Waterloo in his teenage years, been shot through the chest and neck, recovered, went back home to Germany, was put in jail as a political radical, found his way to Boston, became a journalist. And Lieber gave him the idea, which Tocqueville then coined the phrase for, habits of the heart, which Robert Bellah borrowed for an important book of sociology. And the idea was this, and it's right at the heart of the social contract of Rousseau, that what makes a system work is not the written constitution or the code of laws. It's the shared belief of a people in their common cause. And then the legal system will assist that, but it can't be the cause of it. And that's what the habits of the heart have to be. And of course, modern writers like Bellah are lamenting the apparent decay of that.
I was just going to ask you, what do you think of this country at the end of the way you describe this? How are we doing?
Well, in one sense, not so different from those Jacksonian populists, a distrust of centralized government. Tocqueville was very impressed by that. The French government was hyper-centralized in his day, and his father was a kind of provincial governor. He knew all about it. If you wanted to repair the town hall in the south of France, you had to send a requisition up to Paris and wait months while the red tape was gone through, and then they would finally get back to you. He said in America, they just get together and do it. Everything is local initiative. He was overwhelmed by that. And what he would see now is what exactly he did predict, that as the country gets bigger and stronger, as it becomes a world power, as its incredible resources make inevitable, as it runs out of frontier and bumps into the Pacific, it will need a huge central government. And he said individuals may think they don't want it, but each of them has something he wants government to give them. And by the time it's all over, it will not be the America of the 1830s. He absolutely did foresee that. So in a way, all the efforts from left wing to right to resist that kind of collectivity would strike him as absolutely the spirit of the country he knew. But I think he would feel the habits of the heart have decayed, that the confidence, the belief, the almost religious sense of a shared mission that he found all over this continent, he probably would think has largely faded.
Do you have your own ideas about what's right and wrong and the way a country ought to go, and do you have your own political views?
Oh, I do, but I always hate it when people pontificate about areas they don't know enough about. I'd rather not.
Well, what I was just getting at is if he came here today and he made this trip around the United States for 9 months and he picked up on what you observe of this country, what would he predict for the future? He predicted basically what's happened in this country in many ways.
He's predicted a lot of it, just as he predicted, it's often cited and should be. He thought one day the two most powerful countries in the world would be the United States and Russia, each having huge landmass and great resources. But he said, the deepest fundamental basis of a society tends to persist through everything. So just as the French government of his time was highly bureaucratic, it had inherited the bureaucracy of the Bourbon monarchy. It had executed the old aristocrats, but it went on doing what they did. He said, so Russia has the czars, and it will always have a dictatorship. He had that kind of prophetic insight. But I think more he would be struck by just the changes in the huge waves of immigration we've had that began just after his time with the Irish immigrants and, the Italians and the migration of black people from south to north, and of course emancipation. He, like everybody he talked to, thought a civil war was coming one day. So that the Southern culture he rather briefly saw could not survive, based as it was on a kind of aristocracy of whites who didn't work and black people who did. And the West, of course, had hardly been opened at all. So I think he'd be more impressed by diversity and variousness. What he saw then was a kind of homogeneous country. You quote on page 219 from something he wrote in, I think, about 1856. Was that the year of his death? 58. 58, so it was 2 years before that. And he contributed to something called the Liberty Bell. Right. Which was in Boston, an abolitionist publication. Mm-hmm. He said, as the persevering enemy of despotism everywhere and under all its forms, I am pained and astonished by the fact that the freest people in the world is, at the present time, almost the only one among civilized and Christian nations which yet maintains personal servitude. Talking about this country. Right. An old and sincere friend of mine of America, meaning talking about himself, I am uneasy at seeing slavery retard her progress, tarnish her glory, furnish arms to her detractors, compromise the future career of the Union, which is the guarantor of her safety and greatness, and point out to all her enemies in advance the spot where they are to strike. As a man, too, I am moved at the spectacle of man's degradation by man, and I hope to see the day when the law will grant equal civil liberty to all. He wrote that in 1856. And in English, by the way. In English, yes. And long after Democracy in America. So he was still listened to in this country? Oh, yeah. He had American friends that he corresponded with regularly. He said once, I'm almost half an American. It's like it had changed him and given him a kind of identity as a thinker and politician, which tragically made him a marginal figure in French politics, which was very ideological. He was too moderate and too thoughtful to belong to either of the more powerful extremes. But as to the treatment of slaves, there's actually a wonderful 100-page long chapter in Democracy in America on race relations. It's written years and years before that passage that we just heard. And the single informant, I think, that meant the most was indeed Sam Houston, and that was pure chance that he encountered him, a sort of Forrest Gump career as he went through our land. He was coming down the Mississippi in a steamboat. Those Choctaw Indians were being put ashore, and a stallion came galloping up with a big strapping guy on it, and that was Houston, who was not yet the hero of Texas. He'd been governor of Tennessee. He'd quit in a marital scandal of some kind, had moved in with the Cherokee with whom he'd spent his teenage years, and took a Cherokee wife, and was on his way to Washington to try to persuade his old friend Jackson to modify his Indian removal policy. And first they thought, this raffish character can't have ever been governor of a state. He does say in Democracy in America, I've been told that the people of Tennessee have sent to the Congress an individual named David Crockett, who cannot read with ease and has no fixed address. But actually they saw Houston as a really interesting guy, and of course with a wealth of experience. And the idea that Houston gave him was this: the Indian, whom Houston knew so intimately, has been brought up from infancy to be totally self-reliant. To make every decision for himself, to be put in life-threatening tests that only he can surmount. He will never surrender an iota of that liberty to any authority. Therefore, they can't assimilate. Therefore, they're going to be exterminated. He said, the black slave is at the absolute other extreme. He has never been permitted to make one choice for himself from babyhood on. He has lost the language of his ancestors. He doesn't know what their religion was. He has no culture from his former land, and the white society will not accept him. So he's in some limbo in between. And that's really what Tocqueville's working from, not just the politics of slavery, but the tragic betrayal of human rights. So you've been a little more public with this book than in the past. Mm-hmm. And have you done other media? Yeah, I've done quite a few radio interviews. That's very enjoyable. And sometimes face-to-face, sometimes by remote connection. and given a number of talks in various places, which is particularly pleasurable.
But as a professor, you're in the classroom, you have the students in front of you at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, you know how much the media has changed. What's happened to the student?
Well, the students are consumers of media, in fact, increasingly other media than the printed ones. So even Harvard students, all of whom are obviously very bright, do respond to a kind of platform personality that they've become accustomed to on TV. And I think every one of us who didn't begin our careers at Harvard began teaching differently, even when I got there 20 years ago, in order to appeal to an audience that rightly expects a kind of energy and, you know, enthusiasm and so on.
How have you changed?
How have I changed?
Mm-hmm. In the classroom?
Probably in that way. On the other hand, though, this may be also more true of Harvard than a lot of schools. We have quite a few big lecture courses where the one-on-one contact is with the graduate student teaching assistant, and what they want from the professor is indeed a kind of talking head. And when I began my career, which was at the University of Virginia, it was in the 70s, it was partly that era of protest. Everything was then dialogue and exchange, and you expected the students to quarrel and argue with you, and a good teacher would be just ready to hit the ball back over the net. And now it's as though they want to be told, partly because they think you probably know better than they do, but also because I'm afraid they want to get an A, and they think if they write down exactly what you think, they're likelier to give you back what you want. So in fact, I miss the 70s.
You have a course that's available on the Teaching Company.
Mm-hmm.
24 lessons, 30 minutes each on the Enlightenment?
Yeah. When I decided to write a biography of Rousseau, my field was really British culture. I had no credentials in French, although I could read French. And I thought, I'll just create a course that will surround Rousseau as its centerpiece with the kind of things I ought to be knowing more about. So it was partly to teach myself. And it ended up being a very enjoyable course, so I gave it for, I think, 12 years.
Did you have to record it every year? Or
Oh, no. That was the Teaching Company, which is a very well-run outfit, brings you down to the D.C. area, and they have a nice studio, and you do a version of your course that's tailored for their 30-minute segments.
I'm curious, did you have to write it out in advance?
Yeah, although you don't read it verbatim, but I had a teleprompter, and I could see where I was going.
You do this for television or do it for radio?
The Teaching Company those days issued a lot of them as video. I think now it's almost entirely audio. And as we were saying before we began this chat, really I think you receive ideas better if it's only through your ears, as for example when you're driving or doing the dishes, and not necessarily watching people in face-to-face exchange.
What do you say to someone who might be listening and trying to figure it all out, putting it all together? What's the best way to learn about Samuel Johnson and Rousseau and the Enlightenment and Tocqueville and all this intellectual work? I mean, how can the average person better understand this?
Well, partly I think courses like those, are a sort of way in. But I really believe in the original texts. I mean, that Discourse on Inequality of Rousseau's that I mentioned is very fresh, and when somebody meets it for the first time, they're surprised how powerful it is. And I didn't even mention Rousseau's masterpiece, which is called The Confessions, a title he deliberately borrowed from St. Augustine, though without Augustine's sense of guilt and sin. And he invented modern autobiography. He literally invented it, by which I mean every autobiographer before his time, and I've tried to see if this is true, and I think it is, would spend at most 2 or 3 pages on the first 20 years of their life, because those don't matter. Then they become who they are. Then the story begins. And Rousseau spends 200 pages on the first 20 years of his life, because it's the modern idea that those are your formative years, that experiences and relationships from that time shape you. And because he was also a successful novelist, it's brilliantly written. It's like a novel.
A little bit of time left. I want to go back to Alexis de Tocqueville. Lived 53 years, as you say. What were the last couple years of his life like?
They were particularly disappointing. When there was a revolution in 1848, he briefly was made foreign minister of France, the job he'd been waiting all his life to do. Nothing very important happened during that brief time. And then Napoleon III declared himself emperor and got rid of his government, and Tocqueville was out of a job again. By then his health was very bad. He decided he would write a great history of the French Revolution, and he only lived to write the prologue, which is called The Ancien Régime and the Revolution, and it's a classic of political theory and historical study. And then he died. So he died disappointed, feeling that he had wanted to give his life for his country's good, and although it might read his books, it didn't want his services.
You say the attempt to emulate the American model got nowhere.
Yeah, he thought there should be a bicameral legislature. He thought the executive should be separate from the legislature in the way that has always, I think, worked well for us. And actually Hugh Brogan, who has a very good, quite recent biography of Tocqueville, says when Charles de Gaulle was elected president in the 1960s, in the Fifth Republic, he said France finally had a Tocquevillian democracy after trying everything else.
5 republics. What did it mean when there is the one, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth? What did a republic mean?
It meant it's still not a monarchy, but it's got some new constitution, new system of voter franchise, and so on. It keeps starting over again.
You quote him as saying, "You won't easily comprehend the degree of apathy I've fallen into. I'm hardly even in the condition of a spectator, since a spectator at least pays attention, and I don't take the trouble to. This is due above all to the ever-deepening darkness that overspreads the picture, always so dark, known as the future." This is back in the 1800s. Well, how would he feel about today?
He probably would feel even more so, but in particular what he had in mind was he thought that the 1830 revolution in France, though he wasn't entirely sympathetic with it, was an exciting moment of belief in some kind of shared cause. There was a kind of electricity in the air. And he and Tocqueville both said by the 1850s, it's just politics as usual. You know, those ideals of the past are long gone.
Leo Damrosch's name comes from where?
Originally from Germany, though as it was in Breslau, it's now in Poland, but when my ancestors were there, it was German.
As we wind this up, I'm going to put some video on the screen of the village of Tocqueville, where he is buried. There's a statue there in the right near the church where he's buried on the screen there. One of the very few statues you can find of his. Tocqueville, France on your screen. The author for our program has been Leo Damrosch, as we say. He's a Harvard professor, and the name of the book is Tocqueville's Discovery of America. We thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Moi, j'ai fait faire, depuis que je suis là, j'ai fait faire à mon photo la statue d'Alexis. Parce que les gens viennent, me disent, bon, qu'est-ce qu'il y a sur le site? Donc j'ai fait faire le château, nous, et j'ai fait faire la statue d'Alexis. Parce que quand on me demande, bon, le château, il n'y a pas le droit de visiter.
Up next, Prime Minister David Cameron at the British House